Good evening, everybody. And welcome back to Gund Hall for many of you and to Piper. It might have been a while since you were last here. Maybe you were DDes students last time you were here. That's true for some of you, I think. Others have been back a bit more frequently. So let me extend a very special welcome to the alumni of the DDes program tonight here, many of which came from faraway places, including Asia, Europe, and South America. So thanks so much for making the long trip. Others honestly had to simply walk over from other places in Cambridge, so we're local. Welcome to all. I trust many of you were able to connect to the Petra Kutscher that we just completed over in the War Room. That name has not changed in a while. I'd like to thank Gareth Doherty for actually hosting and organizing that. Thanks so much. 30 years of the DDes program is certainly an alibi for hosting a gathering of alumni that each in his or own manner are building on their experience at Harvard as they're making real impacts in practice in the public sector or in the academy. Tomorrow, we look forward to hearing from you. Tomorrow is going to be the day for your stories. Tonight, we wanted to set the tone through a presentation by a faculty member who is not only deeply involved in the program, but who also has a proven track record of research and a long history with the DDes. I could hardly think of a better person to start off the event than Peter Rowe, our speaker tonight. He has been instrumental in the program from its outset in 1985 and continues to play an active role in the DDes Council, in admission, and in teaching the DDes Pro Seminar. Peter hardly needs an introduction. Of course, I'll deliver that anyway. After all, he did serve as dean at the GSD. Many of you know this, and you were here at the time, so was I, from 1992 to 2004. And prior to that, he was chair of the UPD department, and before that, director of the urban design program. His title actually merits some mention. He's not only the Raymond Garb Professor of Architecture and Urban Design, but also the Harvard University Distinguished Service Professor, an honor only bestowed on 32 of the 2,400 faculty members of the university. Prior to Harvard, Peter Rowe served as the director of the School of Architecture at Rice University, where he also led many multidisciplinary research projects through the Rice Center that he directed as vice president. He continues to be very active with research, primarily on contemporary urbanization in Asia, mostly China, but also South Korea, sorry. I know. Yeah, I had to get that in there. North Korea's next, right? He has published extensively. I think we're now at book number 15, and maybe more will be forthcoming. 20, okay. Then you need to update your website. So I have the privilege to working closely with Peter on the DDes Council. He's extremely committed advisor of doctoral students, and he's been teaching the Pro Seminar for years. We do have a kind of unofficial top 10 list at the GSD of advisors. So on that unofficial list of the most requested advisor, he actually ranks #1, and he's been that #1 for years. And I believe, so he has actually graduated over 30 DDes students, and there's still quite a few more to come. Tonight, I believe he will revisit work done a little bit earlier, manifested in a book called Design Thinking, published back in 1987. So long before the term became widely used in a kind of buzzword today. So with that, actually, I'll be turning this over to you, Peter, and so please welcome Professor Peter Rowe.
Thank you, Martin, very much. And I would also like to extend a welcome to all of you. It's wonderful to see you back in the school. And I hope I have time to, over the next day or so, spend some time with you to catch up and what you've been doing and so forth and so on. I also must say that I'm rather honoured to be invited to give the keynote talk tonight. And I thought, given it's the 30th anniversary of the DDes program here at the GSD, that would be appropriate to return, in a sense, to that time of around about 86, 87 or thereabouts, and to reflect forward from that. As some of you know, I was involved in the early framing and implementing of the DDes program along with Bill Doble and Carl Steinitz, who had helped Dean McHugh see it through the university council and, go through all the kind of legislative processes. In fact, I should say that Jerry McHugh was sort of our leader. He, I think, got the idea or brought it with him from Berkeley, I'm not quite sure. But I think he'd be very proud of the program that we have in place. I remember in conversations with him early on, he thought one of the main reasons to do this was to create a forum for developing very explicitly leaders in the design professions. And indeed, if you look at the statistics, there's a better than 1 in 3 chance that anybody in this program will, for some period of time anyway, occupy a leadership position in a private firm or in a government department or in academia, which is an astounding record really when you think about it, and probably makes this the strongest program we have in the school in terms of its impact. And that's what it was sort of designed to do. In '87, it was also when I published, as Martin mentioned, the book Design Thinking, which became sort of a widely based, cognitively based account of architects going about designing. And of course, a lot has changed since then. But this evening, I'm going to dwell on one aspect that has changed, and that is the arrival of the digital age and what that might do to this account of design thinking that I wrote about back then in 1987. So it's going to be a slightly nerdy talk, if that's okay with everybody. To begin with, although the precise onset of the digital age is difficult to pin down exactly, we seem to know when the first large-scale electronic calculating machines, like the ENIAC, for example, were invented around about towards the end of World War II and shortly thereafter. Other ingredients of the modern computer also came along at much the same time or even earlier. If we take into account contributions by the likes of, for example, Herman Hollerith back in 1890 with the census here in the United States, and then Claude Shannon a little bit afterwards of World War II in 1948, and of course Alan Turing, the Brit, during that period of time. It was some time later, though, before the first effective network came online with the American SAGE system in the 1960s. And so the events in this whole sort of evolutionary process were rather incremental. With regard to architecture, it was not until, as my colleague Antoine Picon puts it, the late 1960s and early 70s that the international scene was marked by attempts to relate architecture with what became an increasingly pervasive computer culture, which of course he writes about so elegantly. Rather quickly thereafter, and especially during the 1980s and into the 90s, significant developments in computer applications bearing directly on architecture began to appear and change the field. Certainly by 2000s, many if not most design activities had come under the spell of the digital age, you might say. Computer-aided design software, after the early turning point in the direction of graphic interaction between a designer and the computer with Sketchpad at MIT in 1963, significantly reduced, of course, the need for draftspersons by the 1980s and 1990s. And on the bottom left, we have Ivan Sutherland, who was the author of a Sketchpad, I should say, back in 1963. Simultaneously, universities adopted software that quickly became ubiquitous in design studio and other academic settings. The era, if you remember, of the so-called paperless studios, which of course weren't really paperless. Geometric modeling, enabling the construction and representation of free-form curves, surfaces and volumes arose in CAD as well as in computer-aided manufacturing environments by the late 1990s, followed by three-dimensional printing. In fact, the term was coined in 1995, involving a process for making solid objects from digital models, as we know. More persuasive or more pervasive still, the World Wide Web and Internet came on with a rush in 1992 and 93, after developments as early as the beginning of the 1970s, and about the time of the personal computer, for example, with far-flung computing networks. Personally, I recall working on a forerunner of the DARPA network as a young professor at Rice University, where the network itself was quite small. It involved about 6 to 10 universities. I also remember getting my license as an IBM 360 operator at that time in order to make money to go to school. And of course, that was a really powerful machine. It had probably less of the memory power than my desktop does these days. In sum then, at least 5 areas were either directly enabled or saw major digital contributions in architecture. The first and perhaps most widespread was in representation, ranging from increasingly sophisticated graphics packages to intelligent CAD applications and crossovers into three-dimensional modelling. Despite some lacunae in compatibility in a crowded field, this substantially changed, of course, the way in which the design's world could be viewed and imagined, certainly in terms of its sort of media. A second area was integrative efficiency via digital platforms like building information modelling of otherwise separated tasks, trades even, and even disciplines. A third area was in the building of performance assessment, particularly in lighting, climate control, and various forms of resource consumption and programmatic functionality. A fourth area was with parametric modelling and the use of applied geometries to surface and other features of architecture, including matters of fabrication, like those pioneered by the likes of Frank Gehry, for example, and Pema Stolisa in the 1990s. And finally, a fifth and more recent area involved rapid prototyping, harnessing the capabilities of technical developments like digital printing and three-dimensional modelling married to other construction mechanisms to allow some kind of integrated proof of concept for building components and other devices to be rather quickly fabricated and assembled. Quite a lot of what Martin does, I think anyway, fits into that particular category. However, seen from a more fundamental perspective involving core properties and processes of human information processing embracing fuzzy and even wicked problem sets, the impact of the digital age on design thinking as such is probably less clear. To be sure, designers can accomplish more tasks, some only imaginable in the pre-digital age, and often carry them out more quickly. At a superficial level at least, graphic facility has been increased, as have undertakings and understandings of various architectural means and their effects. Moreover, certain domains of imaginable possibility have become opened up and made more commonplace, largely through the expanded modelling capacities that the digital age has brought. Certainly, access to all manner of structured information has largely moved from the static repositories of libraries, like Loeb here, of various kinds, and become enabled quite literally from a designer's desk. Concomitant advances in communication have altered the manners of teamwork and in many cases made it more inclusive by way of different knowledge and skill sets, as well as from the perspective of those actively participating in real time from far-flung places. Nevertheless, the essential task of designers to resolve what at first appeared to be incommensurate constraints with regard to issues and terms of reference toward potential and satisfactory final outcomes remains. So do the necessities of actionable knowledge, often increased by professional expertise and shaped by acquired heuristic repertoires. As in the more distant past, such as with the invention of and deployment of perspective and related means of seeing, imagining and representation, a major paradigm shift in architectural design has certainly occurred or begun to occur. But the ineffable characteristics of design problems and of design thinking also appear to have remained. If this is in fact so, this is an assertion I'm making, then the broad question before us becomes what, if any, impact has the digital age in architecture wrought on fundamental problem space structuring and problem solving? And furthermore here, let me be clear, by problem space structuring and problem solving, I understand those in the widest sense, incorporating all manners of creative characteristics and certainly not simply the mundane matter-of-fact arrival at a solution, sometimes referred to as rote problem solving. Now, moving further into this topic, design thinking, at least as we have come to know it, has certain properties. To begin with, it's involved with open-ended, ill-defined, and what are referred to as wicked problems. This class encompasses problems without definitive formulation, no explicit basis for terminating problem-solving activity, other than running out of time or something, and where differing formulations necessarily imply differing outcomes and vice versa. With regard to the lack of a clear stopping rule and termination, wicked problems engage with bounded rationality by placing a decision maker in a position of not being able to identify all possible solutions to a problem at hand. In effect, this means involvement with satisficing decision making by accepting the outcome that seems to work best, but may be in fact suboptimal. In both regards, solutions cannot be regarded as either correct or incorrect in any definitive matter. On the other hand, as we well know, the presence of these properties does not exclude the arrival at very good outcomes and ones that have lasting value. We have beautiful buildings, of course. Rather, it means that the structure of a problem space at the outset does not necessarily in itself provide a clear avenue to the solution of the problem at hand or the problem as given. And for this we have to turn in another direction, probably best explained by way of the activity of problem space structuring that was articulated in the so-called information processing model of human problem solving, explicated by two of the gentlemen here, Alan Newell on the top and Herbert Simon on the bottom around 1957 and elaborated further in 1960s. This is a rather odd photograph because the guy with the grey hair was actually the PhD student of the guy below with the black hair. Again, to begin with, in this theoretical perspective, a problem space is a representation of a problem in the form of all possible states and operations, from the most elemental to the most complex and all-encompassing, if you can ever do that. Abstractly, it's often illustrated in the form of a decision tree, with links among operations performed on available information and outcomes of those operations. With a wicked problem, the outset is somehow sketchy and provisional, at least with respect to a final outcome, and operations involve specific knowledge structures that transform the problem space so it evolves in its problem state conditions and further deployment of operations. Now, specific knowledge states, in turn, derive from two kinds of knowledge. The first is what's referred to in the game as domain knowledge and encompasses how much someone knows about a particular field, such as architecture and its salient components of its history, its background, formal aspects of composition, material integrity, and so we could go on. The second is structural knowledge, which involves knowing how concepts within a domain are related, as well as cognitive structures regarding various kinds of problem-solving approaches and when and how to apply them. For architecture, in this bifold definition of knowledge states, extant theory, among other considerations, clearly informs the domain side, whereas what we might call actionable knowledge, professional experience, and decisions undertaken by, let's say, Donald Schoen's reflective practitioner, inform the structural side of things. I should point out that, as far as I know, wicked problem comes from Fritz Zwicky, who was actually an astronomer and came up with techniques for dealing with the morphology of celestial bodies in unquantifiable circumstances. It had nothing necessarily to do with problem solving, but except indirectly, but the name has stuck. This, of course, also mirrors schema theory, ideas about schemata in human knowledge acquisition and understanding. And further, this has arisen from very early roots, of course, in Platonic and Aristotelian categories through Kant's transcendental doctrines of judgment involving a priori pure concepts, on through dynamic environmental and experimental interactions in the work of people like Frederick Bartlett, for example, and the guy with the pipe up there, Jean Piaget, among others. More contemporary accounts concern both generic concepts, or stereotypes as they're called, and how to use them. Marvin Minsky on the bottom, his classic work on artificial intelligence titled A Framework for Representing Knowledge of 1975, for example, made clear reference to data structures as frames, his version of schemata, complete with anticipatory knowledge of how to use a frame, including what to do if expectations about outcomes were not confirmed. Roger Schank, also in artificial intelligence, as well as David Rummelbart, at much the same time, echoed the conflation or mixed or fixed and variable schemes of knowledge. More recent contributions by the likes of Sandra Marshall in her Schemas in Problem Solving of 1997 and then in 2000 confirm much of this and extended into the mapping and scripting of specific types of schemata. In short, both conceptually and practically, schemata represent operable stereotypes, to use the lingo, of situation in the mind's eye, so to speak, of the problem solver, prescribing what to know, what to expect, and how to act or react. Now, within the organisation of a problem space and aspects of schemata, there are also what are often called problem-oriented constraints and autonomous constraints. The first class, problem-oriented constraints, is derived directly from the problem at hand by way of identifying it in the form of, let's say, problem X with necessary and sufficient condition Z for taking action Y. In other words, a clear match of means and clear ends can be discerned, enabling problem solving to move forward with a certain amount of alacrity. In more theoretical terminology, this is usually referred to as a case of means-ends analysis. Autonomous constraints, the second class, going back to Simon's work in the 1960s, are provided by the designer or in order to organise the problem space and do not come directly from the problem as given, but from the problem as understood. Clearly, there is a sufficient presence of constraint characteristics for the subsequent organisation of the problem space to relate to the problem as given, but not complete enough for a fully isomorphic correspondence to be acquired. Otherwise, it would be completely constrained. Just as clearly, some form of reinterpretation is required involving stepping outside, if you like, of a known problem context in order to productively continue problem-solving activity. And sometimes this may involve an appeal to sedimented domain or structural knowledge in order to continue. Put more colloquially, the situation found appears to be something like the design situation tackled sometime before and therefore suggestive of a way of moving forward and a set, provisionally anyway, of autonomous constraints. More generally though, it involves the use of what are called heuristics and heuristic reasoning. If you're wondering what those are, that's the Tower of Hanoi problem, which is where you're supposed to stack up discs on one side to the other side. Anyway, it was a thing invented by a Frenchman in 1886, just so you know what I'm showing you, if it matters. Heuristics, of course, have a number of definitions, often emphasising different aspects of their relevance. For Newell, Simon and Shaw, going back to their classic work, a heuristic is, quote, any principle, procedure or other device that contributes to reduction in search for a satisfactory solution to a problem space. Okay? Or being less emphatic about results, according to David Perkins, a colleague of ours across the way in the Ed School, a heuristic is a rule of thumb that often helps in solving certain classes of problems, but makes no guarantee of a solution. Put even more simply by the mathematician George Polya, heuristics are provisional procedures that are useful in solving problems. Heuristic reasoning, then, is a problem-solving process where it's unknown beforehand whether a particular sequence of steps and decisions will yield a satisfactory solution or not. Moreover, the quality of this outcome cannot be fully assessed until the line of reasoning is completed. And indeed, if it appears to be going nowhere, problem-solving along the lines by the heuristic will be, of course, suspended. In this kind of discussion, heuristics can be distinguished, of course, from exact procedures like algorithms and rote methods of problem solving. It's also clear that the use a priori of domain and structural knowledge of a particular kind plays a significant role in the process and the deployment of a particular line of reasoning towards resolution of a problem at hand. Often, for example, it's difficult to move away from, and we find this in design often, I think, from initial hunches and insights. This in turn refers back again to the designer's rendering of outcomes and otherwise incommensurate constraints, often with emphasis on a priori judgments. Not that that guy in the elevator is doing that. Application of heuristics and heuristic reasoning is also akin to Merleau-Ponty's central idea of situation in his phenomenology of knowledge, at least as far as I'm concerned, by which is meant active involvement in circumstances that derive neither primarily from the objective realm of the things outside ourselves, nor from our own subjectivity. Both are involved in a situation by way of total absorption. And by extension, in design thinking, an attempt is made to overcome a situation's novelty, the problem first confronted, for example, and to make sense of it and therefore make it familiar to ourselves. This in turn often involves an enabling prejudice or a hunch around which to construct frameworks for reinterpreting and reimagining the design problem, back to the idea of the schemata. It may also be quite subjective, but in the general and in time, however, this behaviour usually leads to acquisition of sets of principles that are habitually applied and become sedimented. Moreover, this allows further learning to take place as results take hold and for professional experience to become defined. It also is another way of identifying and discussing various styles of making that can be associated with particular designers and architects. Often it's their interests in particular aspects of domain knowledge and its advancement, along with specific structural knowledge skills and proclivities that lend identifying formal qualities to their work. And I think we could probably all think of examples of this. So far, I've said little about the manner or form of heuristics and other problem-solving devices, and here matters of representation and association immediately come to the fore. Along in the former, that is to say representation, with the role played by languages or representational languages. In these regards, by the 1960s, linguistic relativism, as it was called, had fallen way out of favour as the universal value of human language and cognition came into focus in the hands of luminaries like, of course, Noam Chomsky. By the 1980s and 90s, however, weak versions of the much earlier Sapir-Whorf hypotheses made something of a comeback. These date from the 30s and 40s. According to them, a semantic structure of language shapes or limits the way in which we form conceptions of the world. Others, like Roman Jakobson, went on to say, quote, languages differ essentially in what they must convey and not in what they may convey. It's an odd way of putting it, but this in turn appears to suggest that languages and indeed particular forms of foci of representation oblige us rather than allow us to think in particular ways. I think it's an important distinction. In a more circumscribed world of architectural design, it's reasonably well known that the manner in which we depict or draw often, if not invariably, defines what we draw and ultimately how we design. Less commonly, relatively recent research into digital pedagogy has found that design software used both reflected and enabled particular forms of thought about design. In particular, for instance, a bias was often found towards surface as against space, or the other way around, as a sort of distinction between these two, as it were, modes. In other words, the manner in which heuristics and other problem-solving principles are materially embodied in design process is also consequential, of course, to outcomes and their specific building forms. Now, on the associational side of schemata are the mental structures of preconceived ideas about design problems as suggested by schema theory. Then they include knowledge to carry out information processing as well as the objective relations and so on that might be involved. I think a useful example of this schema is one that was suggested to me by my colleague Michael Hayes during actually a DDes Pro seminar when he reminded us that Rudolf Wittkow, the guy on the top, his reading of Palladio that was actually inspired by Immanuel Kant, followed by Colin Rowe's trans-historical assessment of Palladio and Le Corbusier in his publication The Mathematics of the Ideal Villa in 1978 was an example. We're not related, by the way. He keeps calling me, well, it doesn't matter. Here, of course, was a rather clear alignment of operations involving plans, proportions, harmonies, regulating lines, spatial units, and so on, as indicated by, I think, this rather brief set of images. Moving out still further, the influence of the evolution of architectural theory on design schemata has waxed and waned since 1968, when the proverbial curtain rang down on the dogmatic version of what I might call political modernism. And as we know in these regards, either from experience or through the works of people like Mulgrave, Goodman, Hayes, and many, many others, crises of meaning, postmodernism, post-structural thought, and various other forms of philosophies of differences have been taken on board, while also shifting the field from one of critical insight, more or less coming to a screeching halt towards the late 80s, to one of projective action, where we seem to be today. Nowadays, even movements in the direction of biophilic design and interests in neuroaesthetics seem to be moving back towards much earlier time-honoured understandings of schemata with genetic underpinnings and exhibited preferences that were much more stable than later renditions. In summary then, design thinking may be seen as an unfolding process marked by a sequence of episodes and situations that are coincident with periods of heuristic reasoning through which problems and problem spaces are defined and satisfactory outcomes are sought. During each episode, through schema, particular heuristic devices can be said to be in operation and in control of any reorganisation of the problem space. If you've ever been involved in protocol analyses, that is very clear. The orientation of this operation is neither entirely objective nor entirely subjective. It's actually both, or can be both. Furthermore, between episodes, control is relinquished from one set of organising principles to others. And in addition, the material representation of operation also appears to bias and direct attention, affecting the outcomes as well. Essentially, what's involved is the framing and reframing facilitation that is offered by this overall process that reflects good judgment and the quality of design thinking. Now, looking over this cognitive side of design thinking, two other essential properties emerge, namely what I will call incompleteness on the one and precision on the other. These are sort of provisional terms, I must say, for me. Indeed, design thinking is a process that trades on the presence of both and fundamentally the balance between both for continued problem space structuring. There must be, for example, sufficient incompleteness along the way in order to prompt useful and novel forms of further heuristic reasoning, pushing towards potentially better outcomes. It also, by the way, follows from the properties of wicked problems and ill-defined problems almost in a tautological manner anyway. On the other hand, clear definition or precision is also necessary in order to be able to recognise and to understand successive stages of problem structuring and to ensure success in narrowing the search. Too much incompleteness severely hampers and clearly dooms problem-solving activity, And too much false precision, of course, promotes premature and therefore probably highly suboptimal arrival at outcomes. Now, in all of this, incompleteness manifests itself in at least a number of guises. First, there's a lack of full closure from a specific decision rule aimed at reducing the difference between the properties of a proposed outcome and those that would seem to meet the so-called aspirational set, where you want to go. This may be instrumental in the manner in which a problem space is initially defined, or it can occur during subsequent rounds of information processing. It doesn't really matter. In any event, it's very useful in initiating and helping to define subsequent heuristic operations. In other words, by allowing you to identify what's left out, so to speak. Second, the lack of clear stopping rules and essentially an awareness of bounded rationality and of the open-ended aspect of problem solving encourages, if not obliges, going back to Jacobson, further problem structuring and a narrowing of a search. It provides an insight into where to look best from going on further. Third, as a corollary to this second guise, an inherent understanding of the lack of strict correctness and objectivity in outcomes may lead to lackadaisical problem-solving behaviour, a sort of anything goes, Hail Mary on the one hand, but also be a boon to more rigorous and high-minded aspirational search on the other when it pushes you on to do better. Fourth, incompleteness in material representation also has its positive uses. Sketchy drawings I like, for instance. They usually are more open and can be prompt reinterpretation and further construal than those that are somehow very, very finished and complete. Recognition and understanding of innate biases in particular media and representational techniques, and therefore their incompleteness, can also be constructive, actually, in rethinking and realigning design thinking. So without being overly repetitive, incompleteness, as I intended here, is productive because it enables, by allowing the furnishing of useful information at disjunctions, for continued search and restructuring of problem spaces. And this in turn comes about through more complete inclusion of constraints and their auxiliary conditions in a directed and coherent manner, at least in the mind's eye of the designer. By the way, when I say incompleteness here, I don't want it to be confused with fogginess or not having a clue. Incompleteness suggests enough shape to me to be provocative and suggestive in moving away forward, but not completely, as it were, satisfying all the constraints. Precision, by contrast, is both useful and necessary by operating almost in the opposite direction. First, clear views and understandings of aspects of a problem space structure often allow for conversion into well-defined problems, where goals and ends towards them become more immediately apparent and we can move forward very quickly. And this in turn leads to a truncation, of course, of the overall problem space search. Second, various forms of incompleteness also immediately beg the issue of precision by posing questions of what is needed to be more precise and therefore where to look next. And here the sheer reciprocity between incompleteness, if you like, and precision is clearly productive in moving design forward. Where am I and where do I want to go, as before. Third, high levels of precision in goal set definitions in the first place can be suggestive of potentially productive avenues of reasoning and heuristic choice. This goes back again to the power of prejudices, hunches, and moments of subjective insight, as well as entrainment of certain schemata. Mostly they would seem to trade on reasonable and comfortable degrees of certainty to are seriously entertained and deployed by a designer. For example, in the older stage process models that some of you might be familiar with creative problem solving, this phenomenon also speaks to the recommendation of the time spent, so to speak, on fact-finding before you sort of got involved in a lot of the problem solving activity itself. And finally, the complete and resolution and therefore definition of persistent constraints, the higher the degree of certainty about having reached at least a satisfying outcome, if not one that's more globally optimal, is of course part of this. Now, returning more squarely to the topic at hand concerning the influence of digital age, it becomes evident by way of the alterations that can take place in this balance between essential properties of incompleteness and precision in the process of design thinking. Indeed, I would say the more immersive the process, at least up to some point, of course, the more likely the possibility of alteration. In this regard, of importance is how quality, and I'm not talking about good and bad, but qualities in design thinking are to be understood, for which I think there are at least 4 lines of consideration. First, and perhaps most pragmatically, quality can be assessed in terms of the efficiencies in the problem-solving process, of actually narrowing down the problem space searches and of minimizing the capacities and resources required to do that. We all like to be efficient, I guess. Second, as a corollary, and probably more fundamental, would be enhanced enablement of the generation and consideration of outcomes during the unfolding process, particularly those that were formerly daunting or undoable. And third, and always important, is improved incorporation of knowledge immediately in design thinking about relative performance efficiencies of outcomes and integrative complexities, as well as improved access to domain knowledge in general. And fourth, there is the capacity of maintaining palpable aspects of thingness more present in a design process in both the commonplace meaning of the term as well as in the Heideggerian sense, and for more of the time in the interests of poetic properties and aspirations. Overall, here I am talking about potential enablement, actually, rather than actual or complete use, and I'm also, of course, talking about flasks and Van Gogh's shoes. I don't know if you know much about Heidegger and thingness, but for him it was formed matter. In other words, the fluid shapes is the shape, not so much the external character of the flask. And when it came to the difference between shoes and equipment, in Van Gogh's case, it was a work of art, according to him, because it represented the, as it were, patterns of life that were involved in that in a singular way. So with each drawing of a set of shoes, of which Van Gogh did many, and Heidegger Heidegger used to refer to them fairly constantly, each one was in itself a work of art because it was different from the ones before. And of course, the idea of the work of art in his philosophy was to change the way in which a community understood a certain set of objects and conditions around it. Anyway, I'm not a philosopher, so I'll stay away from that. Now, towards these sorts of ends, there are at least 4 areas where I think products of the digital age appear to have made considerable contributions to design thinking and potentially to its quality. Moreover, in many cases, they impinge on this balance and relative presences and degrees of both incompleteness and precision. And the first area involves aids in productive exploration of conceptual and technical vagaries that begins with a greater variety of readily available representational techniques and with higher degrees of precision. And here one immediately finds a range of graphical techniques, for example, and an easier capacity to move from planometric to sectional presentations into 3-dimensional modelling, among many numbers of ways in which you can use these representational techniques and vice versa. Effectively, what this new precision and rapid pursuit of completeness can provide is better and more concise definition of poorly understood aspects of potential outcomes alongside of those that are less so. This in turn provides potentially better and more comprehensive guidance in further structuring the problem space. In other words, it's a case of definition leading to revelation of incompleteness and then to more directed problem-solving search, followed by definition again, and so on. This overall capacity also allows sub-problems to be more broadly bracketed into otherwise well-defined problems with relatively certain outcomes. And clearly conspicuous instances of high degrees of integration almost by definition can be found in a lot of the software packages and systems that we nowadays employ. A second area of contribution derives from the sheer iterative power of generating test procedures and similar parametric manipulations made possible through computational techniques, including those of a formal kind that significantly broaden the scope of developing a plausible array of satisfactory outcomes. Almost by definition, this then opens up or widens, shall we say, conditions of bounded rationality even if ultimately the condition continues to persist at some level, of course. To some extent, arriving at a clearer view of suitable stopping rules might also be enhanced by observing a broader array of outcomes, although there's no guarantee that that in fact would happen. As demonstrated in reasonably advanced forms of parametric design in architecture, especially those using unusual and otherwise difficult geometric formulations, aspects of this kind of contribution allow concepts to be represented and explored that were essentially undoable before, or at least rather difficult to do. Indeed, in design, the entire area known as architectural geometry, if you like, has blossomed and assumed a conspicuous role because of computing and associated representational software. Moreover, this is quite apart from the similar strides in areas of computer-aided manufacturing and prototyping that lie outside of the discussion that I find myself engaged in here. A third area of contribution is broader access to information along with high degrees of accuracy, scope, and technical sophistication in the evaluation and assessment of outcomes. This essentially involves and applies to the testing aspect of generate and test strategies. Nowadays, comprehensive digital design environments incorporate specific well-tried methods for evaluating various aspects of building performance, layout, structural and material efficiency, and so on, as well as various cost and resource consumption parameters. Here it's not so much the matter that the methods were not known before, but they weren't really tractable in terms of application. The relevance to the quality of design thinking is, I think, twofold, including improved efficiency, of course, and raised levels of certainty and understanding around the phenomenon being assessed, i.e. through better assessment techniques that can be brought to bear rather more readily. Finally, our fourth and closely related area of contribution comes by way of the enhancement of ready access to information across many aspects of problem-solving activity, along with increasingly better research capacities and simulation techniques. If nothing else, there have been notable improvements in certain areas of domain knowledge, primarily concerned with building materials, components and performance, as well as in other broader directions concerning knowledge about the behaviour of more complex interactions, building visualisation and so on. The modelling of lighting, thermal performance, wind flows and so on, and other aspects of environmental response to buildings is a clear case of this, I think. In summary then, we have potentially improved capacities of manipulation, iteration, assessment and informational search. Also, looking across these four areas of contribution, raised levels of definition and precision, or of incompleteness and confusion, seem to be highly likely within problem space structures, providing for more focused attention. And conversely, returning to this reciprocal relationship intended between incompleteness and precision, productive expansion of identifiable yet conceptual and technical vagaries, areas of imprecision and uncertainty enables further and potentially more profound levels of problem-solving activity. Moreover, both conditions take place against the background of domain knowledge that in itself has been significantly improved, at least in terms of its use or application at a point in time. What, of course, has not been replaced or directly enhanced is the actual activity, talent, and heuristic repertoire of a particular designer. It's a bit like donkeys, you know. They can be led to water, but not made to drink. Nevertheless, under the perhaps dubious assumption that higher degrees of facilitation and enablement lead to higher probability of better outcomes, it's a lot of ifs, the idea of design thinking doing better in a digital environment might, I think, cautiously be advanced. Returning to a central line of argument presented here, that as the variety and availability of decision assisting techniques pertinent to architecture design increases, so does the possible marriage to schemata, heuristics, and the expansion and deepening of heuristic repertoires and designers. This in turn also offers the potential, although not the guarantee at all, of better outcomes. One downside, of course, might follow the same route of well-known technological or media takeovers, where the designer becomes either enthralled or victimized, or both, by the digital applications on hand and the inevitable biases and less visible quirks that are built in so as to lose autonomy over the design process in important aspects. Observations and warnings about certain graphic techniques and software mentioned earlier are instances of this. This is a charge, however, that was also levelled, I must say, at various forms of graphic representation in prior eras, with the purported skewing of results. I remember when I was a student at school, the purported skewing of results of the use of axonometric during the 1960s and 70s, coming rather immediately to mind. So I don't entirely buy that argument. On par, though, the digital age certainly seems to have altered significant aspects of design thinking, probably mostly for the better, and without necessarily altering the deeper underlying structure and fundamental procedural aspects of the process. Certainly, as argued here, applications have constructively sharpened the reciprocity between incompleteness and precision, as I understand those two terms, in ways that, if handled well, and I say if handled well, pushes vagueness and the obligation to resolve in a productive direction. Finally, a high premium would seem to have been placed on actionable knowledge and the structural understanding of relations outside of domain knowledge per se, that is a fundamental to the cognitive aspect of design thinking and that which separates really masters from journeymen in these regards. And at this point, I would like to say that I'd like to end where I started, that is to say with the DDes program, by reminding you all that actionable knowledge is also the primary domain of doctoral programs here at Harvard, like ours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Peter.
What?
We have a little bit of time for questions. If there are any questions, comments, thoughts, that was a great time to...
I can't see you.
I know, we can't see you.
Yes, I can see you.
One of those wicked problems.
Yes, hi.
By the way, this is an error. You notice that the error in the computer is catching me, I think, the way through.
Yes, hi. I have a question regarding.
Where are you?
Hi.
Right there.
Yes, hi. I have a.
I can see him.
Okay, good.
Yeah, no, kind of hard to miss. I have a question regarding when you were talking about the Palladio schemas. I thought that was interesting. You mentioned Colin Rowe, but didn't mention too much about George Steiny and his approach to shape grammars and how that's also played a part to it. So I just wanted to get your take on that.
Yeah, I mean, if this is not an exercise on schemata. If I was to do that, we'd be here all day and all night. So, you know, I take the point. I was just using one that popped up in a discussion in a DDes Pro seminar that I thought was pretty clear to use this evening that Michael suggested to us. That's all. I mean, I think you understand what a schemata is, don't you? Yeah. Obviously you do by asking that question. Good. Yes, Branko.
So when I was a student, you know, your book. When I was here, when I was here in the GSD, you know, your book was rather significant, and Michelle and I were just commenting how we both have your book. So are you rethinking the design thinking as you wrote it, and will there be a new version of that book?
Well, it's gone through, I think, something like 15 printings, actually. But no, it's funny. I've given this talk, well, I haven't given this talk before. I've only given this, a version of this talk, this is the third time. Once was in Brazil to a group of sort of fellow nerds like me who worry about this stuff. That was one act, and then once in China when they another similar sort of thing. But I have to say, and I altered it for the preparation of this this talk tonight, and I've gotten re-engaged with the subject, shall we say? So what I would like to do is to think about doing a second edition, if you like, and concentrating a lot more on the relationship of the schemata and schema theory to, because it's an interesting way of introducing the history theory aspects of things into design process without it being in a well nuanced way, right? And where it could be operable in some sort of sense. I'm interested in probably pursuing that, yes. So in this regard, this has been a bit of a test for me to kind of like try out this idea on a few very, very bright people to see if it's not a bad one. But thank you, Branko. I'll pursue it further. Yeah.
Hi, hello. I have a question regarding the notion of the premise of the problem solving itself. I don't even know exactly what a problem is as such, and I wonder if by kind of trying to get designers used to this idea of solving problems, it's not reinforcing a form of messianic position of the designer that pushes the or has some sort of imperialistic description pushed on people.
I understand that. You must understand, I'm using problem here in the very, very strict definition of the information processing theory of problem solving. In the architectural realm, of course, usually we don't talk about it as problem solving because it seems to sort of dumb it all down. And I would agree that, you know, one ought to give examples, which I tried to do a little bit, of where you can understand problem in a much more extended way. So it has the messianic, and it has the sloppy, it has all of the, shall we say, inspiring aspects to it. And of course, when Simon and Shaw wrote their piece, that's what they imagined. Herbert Simon, I mean, I was lucky to have some contact with the guy. He never thought of problem solving and problems in a kind of strict problem sense. He just used the term as a sort of coverall. If you read his Sciences of the Artificial, it's very clear, for example, that that's not what he intended. I mean, I thought you were going to jump all over my labels for incompleteness and precision. Good on you, Antoine.
No, I have a very simple question. Do you think
We have to play this baton thing.
Do you think that notion like precision do not change in nature? Because in some ways
they do.
That was actually my question. To what extent did the computer actually change the notion of precision, its content?
Well, in certain ways it did, I think, precisely. In other ways it didn't. I mean,
from there.
What? Yeah, no. For example, in certain kind of graphical representations we make in machines, they have to be, as it were, not very sketchy. That's a sort of precision. It may be a false precision, but also, I used to have arguments with Bill Mitchell about this, right? He was a big fanatic of precision. And I used to say, well, I like sketchy drawings. And we used to go back and forth on this. And I was sort of like finally convinced by him that if you intend precision here to mean moving beyond a sort of sketchy sketch into an area where it still holds, but it's more precise, then you're better off. And that's the sort of way I read it. I mean, if I was to rewrite this thing, I would lay out, and in fact in drafts, I take incompleteness and precision and have all sorts of other surrogates that sort of present this as a shaded continuum, and where you can pick off certain areas of it. And that came from friendly debates and boxing matches I used to have with Bill over this issue. He was, by the way, involved in the DDes program. Mitchell, I mean.
Just a quick thing.
Ali.
I mean, there is a return nowadays to the sketch, the actual sketch, right?
Yeah.
Away from computation.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts about that?
I think that's fine. I think it'll wax and wane, it'll go up and down. I think as long as it works, I'm for it. I'm, as some of my doctoral students who are here will attest, hopeless with machines. Even though I was the licensed IBM operator, all this sort of thing, I treat them with a certain amount of disrespect. So I do a lot of, I believe in sketches. I don't know, it depends on what it is you're doing. And I like the fact that, I mean, one of the things I'm sort of proud of and happy is when we went into like 92, 93 when I was a dean, we had these big decisions with big bucks associated with it as to what to buy in the computing arena. And all the students and everybody were leaning on me to buy these big, funny looking fat sunscreens. You remember them? Ugh. And I thought, well, I don't know that that's such a bright thing to do. And so we put our money in the infrastructure of an awful lot of software, and people bought their own machines. Guess what? We were right. because it's the slowest moving of the technologies, and that's the one you put the most money into if you're going to invest, right? And I think we never, as a school, we didn't do paperless. And nobody, I think, in the school in their right mind would have ever thought about doing paperless. And I just think that's the way it is. And in the studios I've taught recently, some people are, you know, extremely comfortable in their computer and they kind of sit there with multiple screens and they're fine. Other people aren't. I think it's also a matter of taste and use. Like I say, if you get there, I'm happy. I think model building's good. Not necessarily the mechanical things, although that's really fun as well. Yeah, good. Go ahead.
You've started to drift in that direction. In your talk, you looked at 30 years of change in design thinking.
Well, change in media.
Yeah, change in media.
I would say his design thinking stayed pretty much where it was.
How do you see what happens in the trays here? Is there a link between what you're talking and about in design education?
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. You know, I think.
Does Donald Schoen's stuff have to be recalibrated?
Oh no, I mean his main thesis. I knew him quite well at the time because his reflective practitioner came out more or less the same time as design thinking, and he was down the road at MIT, and we used to talk about it together. You know, his hypothesis was more that design activity is a reflective. It's reflexive, and you do something and get bounced back, right? Which is a little bit what I'm saying also in the way that I was describing it, although I'm using a somewhat different theoretical framework to do that. And I think that holds. And I think what I see in the trays these days is better better as a bar than I saw before. But no, we don't necessarily go as high as we did before or as low.
So the average were...
Yeah, I guess my argument here is at the end of the day, in this kind of milieu, where it's quite, I think we could make the case, if we were to, you know, do an experiment of that sort of adjudication, that the average is probably lifted. But to say that we've ended up with more, you know, Rafael Moneos and whatnots, no. That's not the point I'm making. It's got nothing to do with that, really. Yes, Pablo?
Peter, how do you feel about other disciplines that are kind of like taking over this concept of design thinking? And you can see in the business area, the guys at Stanford created the D school and they are designing business plans and everything. And it's kind of like, is there a cross-fertilization or this is mostly a marketing kind of like takeover?
I've given more talks on this subject in B schools than in architecture schools, as you might imagine. And they go away very perplexed because they get me in there, they read the book, and they, oh yeah, get this guy. And you give a talk and they go, huh? You know, so I think my take on Stanford and the B schools is there's a lot of it's a gimmick, you know? We do everything, you know, give me this stuff. It's like McKinsey on charge, right? And they skirt the issue. The more important work actually is stuff goes back to, you know, where the hell was Simon and John Shaw, who was a programmer, and Alan Newell, who was Herbert Simon's student. They were at Carnegie Mellon working in engineering school. And let's face it, Simon was a political scientist. A Renaissance man, brilliant. But, you know, and that's where I think the good work is still being done. It now verges more over into really, really hardcore AI. Because, you know, in the AI environment, you've got two choices, right? You either act like a human or you don't, right? There are two pathways. My son is an associate professor at Carnegie, and he works in AI and robotics. And he says, Dad, we're going to go the machine route. I go, oh, my God, I'm getting out of here. But there are these very, very divergent views on AI, which I think, who knows who will win. Watson, you know, the one that beats everybody at everything, it's a hybrid. Because it's the higher level routines that are needed to, for it to play super chess and this sort of thing, they're emulating. They're emulating a kind of human behavior which comes from protocol analysis, which comes from this theory that I've been talking about. Whereas the pursuit of that, the grunt, the power, is purely machine. It can just do things just faster than hell, So it's a hybrid. And that's where I think work on that sort of stuff is going on. Yes, Jock.
Got a question. Actually, doing it in the Simon stuff, he's the one that really started, right? Said that all the vocational schools are actually design schools. So the business school, the science, the artificial. I have a question that's almost embarrassing, but what role does beauty play in your sense of design thinking?
Oh, no. That's a very good question. I'm glad you asked it. I think aesthetic judgment is something else I'd like to, shall we say, contextualize into this. I didn't talk about it much tonight, but poetic aspiration and so forth is a big driving force and should be. And there's no reason why, and it certainly comes through all the schemata ideas, right? Because we have aesthetic theories up the what. And of course, a lot of the contributions that come from the history theory guys bear on judgment. A theory of judgment would be good. Yeah, no, I understand what you're saying.
I often mention, this very famous Flaubert quote, architect, all stupid, forget about staircase. But actually they forget about staircase usually because you need at some point in design to move in a paradoxical state of things, a little bit like in slumber. So where does this fit into, where is the paradoxical phase in your vision?
In my vision, it would occur probably at the beginning and in the middle, and hopefully not at the end. I think
it should be staircase by the end.
Yeah.
So I want to mention two maybe developments in two different areas. One is the geospatial technology and the related virtual reality and augmented reality, which basically kind of turns the virtual environment into georeferenced environment, basically give it relevance to the real world. The second development is basically machine learning and deep learning. Basically gives the computer a way to learn all knowledge we have developed.
Watson.
And I'm just curious how design thinking is going to evolve with all the developments in those areas. Sounds to me that it basically...
Well, I think fundamentally it will ineffably stay fairly put. But we will have ways of using virtual environmental circumstances and the machine learning processes to, as it were, take on tasks that we can leave alone and have done better. If I'm designing a robot, do I make it do what I do? I don't think so, mate. That answers your question.
So one thing that, for example, when we look at the game of Go, the AlphaGo, basically the machine learned all the things that people have developed in the last 3,000 years and then come up with some very creative solutions.
I'm glad about that. I watched the game, as a matter of fact.
Yes, so I just want to...
well, fine, okay. We can put that aside. It doesn't mean we can put life aside. It doesn't mean we can put the design of everything aside, does it? Or at least I hope not. Or I hope you don't think that. Actually, it would be dangerous, I'm afraid. All right. Enough of me.
Yes,
we get drunk
you.
now, right?
Well, we never get enough of you.
Yes.
Okay, another.